Dear colleagues, good morning. We are starting our Arria-Formula meeting, and I wholeheartedly thank you for joining us today. I must say from the beginning that some of our Western colleagues enriched our informal working methods on Arria-Formula meetings by choosing not to participate, and they explained their absence by the fact that some of the briefers are on their national sanctions list. I would remind in this regard that previously Russia participated in all Arria-Formula meetings where persons who are in our stop lists were briefing, namely the leaders of the so-called Majlis of Crimea Tatar people or other persons wanted for their criminal activities. Now we have no other choice but to act reciprocally. I think that fellow council members deserve better respect. In any case, dear colleagues, it has been over 7 years now that the UN Security Council, among other international fora, is engaged in discussions of the crisis in the east of Ukraine. But the situation in the present-day Ukraine as a whole also deserves to be considered, as it is all too often neglected. Discussions on Ukraine, when organized by Ukraine or Kiev backers, tend to present the armed conflict in Donbass or events in Crimea as the reference point of the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine. They claim that crisis started in spring 2014, as if it appeared out of the blue and as if nothing was happening prior to that. Since it is well known in the United Nations that the understanding of root causes of conflicts is an essential condition of their sustainable resolution, we organized an Arria-Formula meeting on May 5th, where 5 briefers from Ukraine, all direct participants or victims, shared their stories, pointing out to the real drivers of conflict in their then and now deeply divided country. Of course, by now we got used that some of the council members would remain deaf to the first-hand testimonies and wouldn't stop repeating that anything contradictory to their official position is sheer Russian propaganda. But we do believe that in order to make council's resolutions respected, we should dig into details of why and who failed to make them implemented. Today, we will make another effort to analyze why the resolution of the Council 2202 that endorsed the package of measures for the implementation of Minsk agreements 6 years after its adoption in 2015 has not been implemented by the Kiev authorities, who prefer to blame their faults on the alleged external threats and involvement. We plan to address the event that split the history of Ukraine into the periods of before and after, and divided the whole Ukrainian society. That event is the Maidan. As always, we have invited those who have either been personally engaged in the situation or directly witnessed it through the camera lens. But before giving the floor to our distinguished briefers, allow me to say a few words in my national capacity. For Russia, Ukraine is an immediate neighbor with closest historical, cultural, and family ties, the place of our common roots and birthplace, and brotherly people. To us, as well as to millions of Ukrainians themselves, it was crystal clear from the outset that Maidan was forcing the country into an unnecessary and dangerous choice, not only between Russia and the West, but between and among Ukrainians themselves, between the ugliest forms of nationalism and multicultural and tolerant society. Ukraine that we knew before 2014. Ukraine that was kidnapped by present Kiev authorities. This choice was orchestrated from the outside and driven by radical nationalists from the inside. With years passing, Ukrainians will not forget the most tragic pages of that history, like mass murders in Odessa and Mariupol, or the tragedy of the so-called Heavenly Hundred. Despite absence of any will from authorities to investigate those crimes, more testimonies are coming to surface. Witnesses who spoke at the May 5th Arria-Formula shed light on what was happening in the regions. It is also not a secret to anyone in Ukraine today that the deadly gunshots made at Maidan in February 2014 are likely to have come from snipers under the orders of the coup leaders themselves. In particular, David Zhvania, former member of the Ukrainian parliament, recently made stunning revelations in that regard. Similar conclusions were made 4 years ago by a professor of the School of Political Studies of the University of Ottawa, Dr. Ivan Kachanovsky, in his work, Snipers Massacre on the Maidan in Ukraine. However, despite all these sensational testimonies, the investigation once launched by Kyiv is unsurprisingly making no headway. It is also no secret that European countries and the United States were proactive at all stages of Maidan, encouraging the upheaval and the radicals behind it. Today, 7 years later, the results are very well known. Authorities in Kyiv enjoy the same support despite the lack of engagement in the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Kyiv seems to be very encouraged by the military support it receives from abroad to help fight its own citizens in the east of the country, who only wanted to negotiate with Kyiv the way the country will live after the Maidan coup, but received bullets and shells instead. There should be no illusions. The continued militarization of Ukraine by the Western countries, the support of drawing up forces to the contact line in Donbass, and the NATO exercises, such as Defender Europe 2021, or any other, are not bringing the normalization of the situation in Ukraine and in the region any closer. I will spare you of the account what Ukraine turned into economically, socially, and culturally. I will leave this chance to our briefers to share this with you. I believe that today's discussion would help further clarify the background of the crisis in the east of Ukraine. I also hope that the main message is clear. Unless the Western supporters of Kyiv change their position on further encouraging Kyiv's aggression, violence, neo-Nazism, and unabated nationalism, the conflict in Ukraine will yet be far from resolution. This being said, I'm happy to open our discussion. Let me inform you that our briefers will be speaking 3 different languages, Russian, English, and French. So please do not hesitate to use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. The participants wishing to take the floor after the briefers to make a statement or raise questions to the panelists are welcome to indicate it through the Zoom chat function. And I would also remind you that you should keep your microphones switched off in order to not to create an echo when somebody is speaking. Now I'd like to introduce our briefers. Mr. Nikolai Azarov, former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mr. Oleg Tsarev, former member of the Ukrainian Parliament, Rada, Mr. Vladimir Aleynik, also former member of the Ukrainian Parliament, Mr. Dean O'Brien, a freelance photographer documenting conflict in Donbass, and Ms. Anne-Laure Bonnel, a journalist and filmmaker from France. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Azarov. Nikolai Yanovich, слово ваше.
Глубоко уважаемые дамы и господа, в эти
Ladies and gentlemen, in the brief moments of my account, I'd like to address how over several years my flourishing country that used to produce spacecrafts, Sputniks, aircraft, huge vessels, and many other things, and had a GDP greater than, say, Poland, turned into the poorest country in Europe and probably in the world, with poor population, with the highest in the world level of mortality, with outrage of Nazi groups, who throw Nazi greetings in the streets of Kiev and kill the people they don't like, who do not share their political views. And I'd like to say that this story started approximately in the year 2000, when Western countries and Western special service started to create those neo-Nazi extremist groups in Ukraine, which pursued the task of forcefully seizing power in the city. First, they manifested themselves in December 2004 in Ukraine, when the so-called Orange Revolution, the revolution of color, happened in Ukraine, when those groups attempted to seize the government building, the Supreme Court building. Back then, I was deputy prime minister, and thanks to our efforts and to the efforts of the then President Yushchenko, we managed to stop the bloodshed. However, we didn't manage to stop the bloodshed, which was planned for February 2014, when Western special services implemented their idea to neutralize the leadership of Ukraine that was carrying out the policy of equal interaction with former Soviet countries, which were natural markets and trade partners for us, and also with the European countries with whom we were negotiating an association agreement. We know that inside the country and outside it, such neo-Nazi groups, such militants were being trained and prepared. We knew that they were being prepared for the events of 2014, when another president election was upcoming. Our special services had a task to track all such ties, to establish all relevant contacts. But unfortunately, the situation developed too fast. And when in November 2013, our government decided to postpone the signing of association agreement because we thought it was not beneficial for us, they made use of this pretext to launch provocations that were aimed at carrying out a coup d'etat. At this point, those militants emerged from the underground and carried out several provocations, which resulted in capture of the trade union house located in the center of Kiev, near the governmental building. They also seized the mayor's office and displayed a huge portrait of Nazi collaborant Bandera on its facade. The basement of this building was re-equipped into a torture room where the newly emerged Democrats tortured all those people who they suspected cooperated with the authorities. The so-called Maidan was overstated in terms of participation. At the same time, there were many people who simply were paid to participate in those events. Our special services had their agents at Maidan, and they reported their plans to the leadership of the country as far as the official side of Maidan was concerned. However, the US Embassy in Ukraine had a special group that coordinated all the main acts to overthrow the legitimate authorities. What were those acts? Those were encouraging the upheaval. Those were the provocation related to kidnappings, to killings of activists. Among those activists, they listed Belarusian citizen Zhitnevets and Armenian, whom they sacrificed and quickly blamed it on the authorities. So the provocations started to escalate. They used all means to attack governmental buildings, to attack law enforcement officials. They threw Molotov cocktails at them. And I must say that by the end of Maidan, our hospitals and medical facilities admitted over 2,000 people who were associated with law enforcement and who were heavily injured. Provocations are known regarding the so-called beatings of children, of students. When I was informed of such events, I delegated it to the Minister of Healthcare to make a tour of hospitals, gather the information on all the injured, and report it to me. When I received a list of those individuals, I saw no students, no children on this list. Mostly those were people of 40, 45 years old who originated from Western Ukraine. This is just an example to illustrate how deceitful provocations were used to carry out this operation. It was spread through the oligarch-owned media. And in the same evening, there was the first attempt to seize the presidential administration. We realized that we needed to take all steps to protect our constitutional order. At that point, heads of Western states started to address us, officials from foreign diplomatic missions, who called on us to use negotiations, to abstain from the use of force, to walk the path of compromise, even though it was clear that the situation was driving near coup d'etat. However, the then president of Ukraine tried to start negotiations. He engaged in prolonged talks that were absolutely useless because the goal was clear, at least for me from the very start. The goal was to overthrow the legitimate authorities. And actually, the United States did not try too hard to conceal those plans. When I met with Ms. Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State at that point, she directly said that we needed to reform the government to include, and then she named several names. At that point, I had to ask her, what did she have to do with our government and with its composition? Because under our constitution, the government is formed by coalition, and the coalition would never agree to include such people as Mr. Yatsenyuk. And as you know, that after the coup d'etat, Mr. Yatsenyuk was at the very top of this system. Those who seized the power in Ukraine accused the incumbent president Yanukovych of giving up his office and leaving the country, even though he was still in Ukraine, and even though on the 21st of February he signed an agreement with Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland and Germany's president and Minister of Foreign Affairs of France as guarantors, who guaranteed that this conflict would be peacefully settled and foresee presidential elections. Nevertheless, provocations continued. As a result, there was a massacre at Maidan with over 100 people dying. And not only protesters at Maidan died, but also about 30 law enforcement officers. It was clearly established that the shooting was started by the provokers who were trained to be there and to act like this. It was clearly established that Parabion and Pashinsky were the ones to dispatch the main commands and orders. Those were members of parliament whom we could not arrest. We should have, but we couldn't because they had the so-called MP's immunity. And our main mistake was that we abided the law. whereas we encountered action that abided no law at all, and that was supported by Western special services and embassies of Western countries. I summoned J7 ambassadors, demonstrated documentary photos to them, demonstrated how Molotov cocktails were being prepared, how explosives were being prepared, who financed it, how the funds were distributed. I demonstrated it all, and they saw it all. What struck me was the reaction of Germany's ambassador, who said that it was not indicative of anything, that it was peaceful protest. So he said that basically what was white was black. How can a protest be called peaceful if it used snipers, if it used weapons, if snipers shot at people's backs, which was also documented? There are document testimonies of Georgian snipers. There is document testimony of Mr. Zvania that Ambassador Nebenzia already mentioned today, who was one of the leaders of Maidan, who said he was ready to testify regarding the organization of a coup d'etat, of the participation of Western special services in the process, but no one invited him to give this testament. Nobody listened to him in the West. This sort of hypocrisy is what we got in response. I can talk about it indefinitely because I witnessed it all. I witnessed it all from the window of my office. The Maidan Square, I could clearly see the Maidan Square. And there was a thin line of law enforcers that divided this crowd at Maidan from our building and from our offices. This is how we were operating. And at the same time, Western ambassadors were telling us that it was a peaceful protest. Western diplomats arrived at Maidan. Senator McCain, Ms. Nuland, together with Ambassador of the United States, all Western ambassadors, including the Ambassador of Poland, we forgot his surname, unfortunately. He also arrived at Maidan, and more than that, he called to overthrow the authorities. That was, as he said, anti the people. So we saw what recently happened at the Capitol, and we compared it with what the Americans used to tell us regarding peaceful protests. No one prevented them from seizing 150 people from arresting 150 people who tried to seize the Capitol. Whereas when we arrested 10 people who clearly were provokers, we encountered protests of Western countries. Well, again, our mistake was that we listened to those protests. What happened after the coup d'etat? We became the poorest country in Europe. And a punitive expedition in Donbass was initiated, where people, ordinary people, miners, workers, tried to stop tanks with their bare hands. At the beginning, the Ukrainian army refused to shoot at people who had not supported the coup d'etat. Back then, Mr. Turchinov ordered to release criminals from prisons who were serving the punishment and who had served 4 or 5 punishments by that point. He released them in order to form battalions and dispatch them to the Caucasus, where they committed such evils that even the new regime had to condemn, and it had to condemn to renewed punishments some activists of Tornado Battalion. How can we assess the bombardment of Luhansk? How can we assess the fact that Mr. Parubi forced people into a building in Odessa, set it on fire, which resulted in the deaths of many people. And when those who tried to save their lives by jumping from a second or third floor were finished off. How can we assess all this? 7 years have passed, but no one investigated it. No single Western embassy claimed any protest. What happened next goes beyond any frameworks. I mean, electricity supply line to the Crimea was undermined, which left the peninsula without energy supply, because the only electrical supply line was undermined, which left hospitals, schools, kindergartens without any electricity. Then they blocked the channel that supplied water to Crimea. How can we call it in front of the civilized world? How can we call the blockade of food supplies to the Crimea? It is a peninsula, and the only on-land connection with the peninsula goes from the territory of Ukraine, which organized blockade to undermine all food deliveries, and it happened in winter. The Russian government had to take immense efforts to build the Crimean Bridge and to establish uninterrupted supply of medicines and foods to the Crimea, to say nothing of energy supply. Such acts clearly indicate what sort of regime gained authority in Ukraine. More than 10 million people left Ukraine. 30 million people left instead of 52 million people. And this is the regime that the Western countries support. It just stuns me, because I was among the people who elaborated the association agreement with the European countries. We hope that we would implement many European approaches and many European values in our country, but now I understand no longer what values can we be talking about. Is it a value that opposition politicians are imprisoned, that food and energy supplies are interrupted? What values are we talking about? I will stop here, and if there are any questions to me, I'm ready to answer them right away.
I'd like to remind one sad date that Mr. Azarov referred to. Today is the exactly the 7th anniversary, 2nd of June 2014, when those missile strikes of Lugansk from the air took place. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Oleg Tsarev, the former member of the Ukrainian parliament. Oleg Anatolyevich, вам слово.
Уважаемый Василий Алексеевич, участники
Esteemed ambassador, dear participants of the conference, my name is Oleg Tsarev, deputy of the calling of the Ukrainian Rada and deputy head of the fraction of regions. So today I would like to tell you about the events that I witnessed myself. And I think that in order to have a complete picture of what was happening in Maidan, I would like to begin with the events that preceded Maidan. On the 20th of November 2013, I spoke at Verkhovная Rada and told that the US is preparing a state coup in Ukraine. With the direct involvement of the US Embassy and ambassador in the framework of a project called Tech Camp, they trained specialists on information wars and discrediting state institutions through modern media. They were training people, and it was curated by U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. And among the instructors were the U.S. citizens Meta Berga and the representative of the State Department, Kara Andrada, employees of the diplomatic mission, head of deputy, head of the press office of the embassy. As example, the U.S. instructors told how social media was used to stage and manage street riots in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya. The last conference of Tech Camp took place on 14th and 15th of 2013, right on the territory of the US Embassy. I got all this insight thanks to a so-called cover-up operation that I made, because I sent my people that pretended to be IT specialists to take part in Tech Camp program, and they gave me audio and video proof of the activity of what that was happening in the U.S. Embassy. And as a result, I sent a deputy request to the president of the country and the law enforcement offices, warning them about what was going on. Upon the request of the leadership of a party and the fractions during Maidan, I was in charge of interacting with law enforcement and media. I received confidential info from the prosecutor's office, security council, and police, and then I processed it and spoke at press conferences and on TV. Western ambassadors were actively involved in promoting Maidan. Even before Maidan, the US ambassador and Western ambassadors acted as though they were Ukrainian politicians. They were actively assessing and discussing all the issues of the domestic political agenda, on adopting laws, on assessing the actions of the cabinet of ministers and politicians. And after Maidan, it was done on constant basis. Leaders of oppositions every day, pretty much every day, they went to the US Embassy, where they held meetings and received instructions. And I also sent people from my party, and they recorded all this information, and I showed it, demonstrated during press conferences. And to give you an example, I will tell you a curious, so to say, story. On the evening of January 11th, 2014, in Kiev, during Maidan, a former chief policeman of the country, Lutsenko, protesters, and a number of people deputies tried to free people who were convicted on the Vasilkov case, Vasilkov terrorists. Those terrorists, they were convicted for laying explosive inside the monument to Lenin and planned to blow it up during the festivities on the Independence Day, which could lead to multiple deaths. And those convicted terrorists would have spent a long time in prisons if it weren't for Maidan, because during Maidan, those terrorists, they were called political prisoners, but the protesters and Lutsenko, they tried to free them from the convoy. Lutsenko was clearly inadequate. He tried to fight the guards. And after those events, the ambassadors, four ambassadors of Western countries, they made a statement blaming the authority. The thing is that Lutsenko was hurt, and then at the hospital, they drew his blood, and the blood test showed that he had an incredible amount of alcohol in his blood. But after this blood test, Lutsenko asked for another blood test at a private clinic called Boris, and those results show that he had very little alcohol in his blood. And under this pretext, they started gathering people at Maidan and saying that the government was doing unlawful things. And we've held our own investigation on billing, on phones. We have tracked the whole trajectory of Lutsenko. And the most curious thing, at that certain time and certain point, Lutsenko's phone was at the same point as the phone of the ambassador of Germany. And the ambassador of Germany visited Lutsenko at hospital right after his injury, and then he made a very furious statement on the account of the actions of the government authorities. And when we understood that they met the day before the event, the ambassador of the Germany, and Lutsenko. We found out where it was. It was a coffee shop, and we um, we investigated, found the bill from their table, and they drank a lot, as it turned out. So we listened to the recording of Lutsenko's conversations, and we even listened to the conversations of Lutsenko's wife with him, where she scolded him for drinking too much. And we also listened to her conversations of Lutsenko's wife with the representative of the private clinic, where she asked them to falsify the results. And I'm not a diplomatic worker. Um, I was educated as an engineer, and please tell me, I'm talking to diplomats here. Probably diplomats also taught some theatrical skills. What kind of face you need to make to speak at a press conference and to blame the acting authorities for falsifying the results, if the person who is blaming himself was drinking strong alcohol with the person involved? Those were the actions of the Western ambassadors. And Maidan would have been impossible without financial means, large financial means. The protesters, they were gathering funds, but that wouldn't have been enough for Maidan. An interesting fact is during Maidan, the US were issuing new bills, and none of the new Ukrainian bills imported those new bills. Nevertheless, we had those new bills in large numbers in Ukraine, and diplomatic couriers were not examined, and it is not examined. This is the rules. And but the weight is tracked, and significant changes tell a lot. From the from the outset of Maidan, the weight of the diplomatic courier and mail that came into the US grew up, and we recorded the process of unloading planes with from the US Embassy. The two huge cars and the huge large bags were loaded in cars. And there was the limo also that came, and it also got loaded with huge bags, and there are videos of shootings of that that are uploaded on the internet. Apart from money, they also needed people that they pulled from all over the world. The people from Serbia, Marko Gipkevic, the head of the organization, of course, who was overthrowing Milosevic, Mihor Saakashvili, who was organizing the Rose Revolution in Georgia. On the 24th of December 2013, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and the law enforcement authorities, they satisfied my request to prohibit 36 citizens of Germany, Georgia, and the United States from entering the country. And it was called the Tsarov list. The politicians, politician Mikhail Saakashvili had to leave the country. And on New Year, we had a hope that the protests would stop and we will keep the country. But those hopes failed us. The technology of Jim Sharp didn't work from Yanukovych. This technology consists in provoking the authorities and using violence, then to be appalled by the actions of the authorities and bring more people into the streets. And those non-violent protests didn't work because the authorities didn't use force, and the injured policemen outnumbered the injured protesters. I visited the policemen in hospitals. They had broken legs, they were burned, their teeth were missing, they were head injuries. And those young soldiers from law enforcement authorities, they were people threw Molotov cocktails at them, and they weren't allowed to use force, so they had to just to try to flee and escape those cocktails. And those two Maidans that I saw were based on crimes and lies. The Orange Maidan, there was the falsified imprisonment of Yushchenko and other actions. The country received more and more specialists on destabilizing the power in January in Ukraine. Under his own with his own passport, Andris Butkavichus entered Ukraine, and I'd like to draw your attention to this person, Andris Butkavichus. He was officially prohibited from entering Ukraine because he was accused of commanding the snipers who killed the protesters in Vilnius in 1991 and in Kyrgyzia in 2005, and also in leading riots in Georgia. Nevertheless, Audrus entered Ukraine and the prohibition was lifted by one of the generals, and who worked at the security of and Security Council. And when they found out who allowed him to enter the country, there was a huge scandal at the Security Council, and there was no way that this information would remain hidden, because the US Embassy controlled everything, and the first place that this person went to was the US Embassy. There were Georgian snipers that entered the city, but also specialists from Poland, Australia, and the Baltic states, and they started training hundreds of people. And they were trained of how to work with weapon, how to use Molotov cocktails, and the snipers who came, they shot in protesters and policemen, and that laid the foundation for the myth of the Heaven's 100. And a few words about the elections, just for you to understand the background. I was registered as the candidate for the president of Ukraine. The south and east of Ukraine did not accept the coup. And I traveled through the south and east of Ukraine. I met all the protest leaders, and there was an understanding that the Ukraine was a step away from a civil war. On the 14th of April 2014, upon an invitation, I went to one of the most popular programs in Ukraine. My goal was to speak to the people of Kiev and to speak to the people and tell them that we should stop, find a compromise, otherwise we'll have a war. And in my address, I said that I discussed with the protesters of the southeastern part of Ukraine their demands for stopping the protests, the federalization of the country, the Russian as a second state language, and sit at the table, a negotiation table, to discuss those conditions, to accept those conditions. Was that a big price to pay for the peace in the country? But the fighters from Maidan, they came to the studio, they demanded for me to come out, and I asked for help. I asked OSCE observers to help, but they told me that their task was to observe and not to interfere. So I had to come up to the fighters because otherwise they would storm the studio. I was beaten, and in a couple of seconds they tore all clothes, everything from me. Everything was showed on TV. The Ukrainian and foreign channels, they all broadcast all these events. My family, my mom were watching all of that. They suggested for me to one way out. I kneel in front of those people. I ask for forgiveness, and I decline my candidature for the presidency. And then they would let me go alive. Otherwise, they will throw me into the crowd, and then I would be torn apart. I refused, but nevertheless, I survived. The organizers of Maidan that the execution by the crowd that would be broadcast live on TV would not add legitimacy to the elections. And then a number of Western and international politicians came up with statements, including Ban Ki-moon. And I tell this just to show you how everything is done in order to fight protesters, because all means are used. I was lucky I survived, but after Maidan, just in 1 year, 4 of my colleagues and friends, deputies of the Ukrainian Rada, were killed. Alexander Petrushenko, Stanislav Melnik, Mikhail Chechetov, Oleg Kalashnikov. Oleg Kalashnikov, I called a day before he was killed. I told him, "You should leave, they'll kill you." He told me, "I'm organizing a victory day in Kiev, and after the event, I'll leave." But then he couldn't do that. Alexander Petrushenko, when I came home, he came to Dnipropetrovsk. I live close to Dnipropetrovsk airport, and he used to visit me a lot. Alexander loved life, and he had a young wife, and we used to sit down, drink together. The police told that it was suicide, and they told he shot himself in his neck from a gun. Have you ever heard of people shooting themselves in the neck? And I only told about the deputies and politicians, but there were hundreds of other victims that were killed by the nationalist teams. Kiev regime continues through legal and illegal ways to fight those who oppose it. And the leader of opposition is arrested, Igor Melnichuk. There's despair in the country. The external debt is growing. There's war in the country. The social standards are being lowered. Every day someone is being killed. There's banditism. Grenades are being exploded in the country. Weapon is used. And the main question that no one can answer is who will be held accountable for that? Why are the rights of Russian Ukrainians being violated in Ukraine when there's no investigation into the killing of the 100 people during Maidan? Why no one is held responsible? Why, right in the court, they freed those who were accused of killing Olesya Buzina were freed? Why the violations of the constitution? Why in violation of the constitution the army was used against Donbass? Why Ukraine is not implementing and delivering on the obligations undertaken under the Minsk agreements? Why people, children are dying? And the main question is who will be held accountable for all of that? That after being a regular European country, our country turned into this. And the countries who were guarantors of the agreement between Yanukovych and the leaders of the opposition of the 21st of February of 2014 would be implemented. Those European countries, will they be held accountable for the opposition violating those agreements the next day after signing them? Who will be held accountable? I thank you. Thank you, Oleg. Yeah.
Azarov might have to leave due to family reasons, but before he left, I think that it would be appropriate if we let him speak out, perhaps with his final notes, which he might not able to make in proper time. Mr. Tsarev told us about persecution of opposition in Ukraine, but it was not only opposition persecution, but the authorities before Maidan were also threatened, and I know that Mr. Azarov himself was threatened. His life was threatened even before Maidan, and other Ukrainian officials were receiving death threats before it all happened. Maybe you could say a few words about that, or whatever you want to choose to tell us again, Mr. Azarov. Nikolai Yanovich, вам слово.
Спасибо, Василий Алексеевич.
Thank you, esteemed ambassador, the only thing that I would like to add is that on the 28th of January, about 3 weeks before the state coup, upon the agreement with the president, I decided to step down as a prime minister. Why? So for us, through a peaceful way of compromise, to engage with the opposition, to establish new government and put an end to this political crisis. And by then, it didn't gain the scale, those horrific scale, and there were no bloodshed yet. And I spoke to the Ukrainian people saying that I will step down for the sake of settling the crisis through peaceful means. And I asked the president so that he would sign my declaration, my statement, only after the militia would free the center of Kyiv and would set free all the law enforcement officers and would free all these buildings of the state institutions that they captured. And as I mentioned, that was the city hall and the ministry, the building of the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Agriculture, and a number of buildings in regions, the regional administration buildings in the west of Ukraine that were captured, the buildings of the security forces, and even one military site by so-called peaceful protesters, that Westerners were saying that those are peaceful protesters. And I told the president and the Western ambassadors that I met that I was ready to resign with one condition, that there was a peaceful settlement and the coalition government would be formed, and that thus we would put an end to this conflict that later turned to the state coup. And everyone guaranteed the implementation of those obligations. But once the president signed this decree and entered into force, everybody refused to implement it. And after my resignation, they started to demand the resignation of the president as well. And I would like to support the words of Tsaryov about how can we agree with the US and the Westerners if the obligations, the most serious obligations, are being violated at this level. That's everything I wanted to say. Thank you, Nikolai. I know that you probably would have to leave, and we hope that all the problems that you have would be settled in your family.
Thank you very much, Mr. Azarov. I would like to give the floor now to another former deputy of Ukrainian Parliament, Mr. Vladimir Arekin. Vladimir Nikolaevich, вам слово. Владимир Николаевич, микрофон надо включить.
Vladimir Nikolaevich, turn on your mic, please. Okay, it's working now. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed ambassador, thank you for this opportunity to speak on this issue, to present my point of view. And I will speak as a lawyer and as a person who was working in the court system. And I would like to give a legal assessment of this event. Nikolai Yanovich was speaking about Lugansk on the 2nd of June of 2014. The Lugansk was, there was artillery shelling of Lugansk, and 8 civilians died and 28 were injured as a result of those aerial shelling. And up until now, there was no investigation of the section, and the state coup is an unconstitutional grab of power with the use of weapons and violence, and as a result, from external management of the situation with Donbass and poverty. Right now, there is a civil divide in Ukraine, and the power is controlled by nationalists. And I think that the situation in Ukraine should deserves great deal of attention from the international community, because there are 50 nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and the instability and the low management can lead to tragic events. And we should remember about Chernobyl. There were other reasons for that tragedy, but here um, we deal with irresponsibility of the power. And in reality, the Western parties wanted to get control of the Ukrainian authorities, and to get what they get as a result is the external management of the country, of legal bodies and other bodies of the country are managed externally, and the national bank that is controlled by the IMF. And if we're speaking about the political level, that the US embassy is involved in all political decisions of, or the G7 ambassadors, if we're speaking about such things as special services and army, they're fully under control. So there is full external management. What did the West get? Everything they dreamt of as the cheap labor force market. And if during the war, my mom, that was 16 years old, the Nazis, they brought her for forced labor to Europe. Right now, there's no need for force enforcement because there's poverty in Ukraine, and then people are needed to gather crops, for example, in Western countries, in Italy and Germany, and they get it from Ukraine. And the EU is doing everything for the economy of Ukraine to be stalled. For example, they prohibited the development of engineering fields and the projects that are anti-Russian, the nationalism, um, prohibiting Russian language, and they're very hostile. And as a result, they're in contract with Russia, Hungary, Moldova, and other countries, and Romania, for example, because they do not allow Romanian minorities to speak and teach their language. Uh, and um, and there are lots of fights, and without external interference into the domestic affairs of the Ukraine, the state coup would be impossible. And there are one of the basic foundations of the UN Charter is the non-interference. There is also declaration on the non-interference, and this declaration was adopted on the 21st of December 1965. And now I'd like to call names that interfered in the internal affairs. On the 26th of November, there was no serious issues of association. And on the 26th of November, Valeta Ranjanina spoke in supporting those part of Maidan that did not accept the decision. And on the 1st of December, they spoke Yaroslav Kaczynski, the head of Poland, Jacek Protasevich, and the 3rd of December, ex-speaker of Georgia, Baranidze. On the 7th of December, Mikhail Saakashvili also spoke, the deputy of the European Parliament, Pavel Kolov, extra prime minister of Moldova, Vlad Filat, deputies of Euro Parliament, Vlasic Pranka, Elmar Brok, Buzek,
11th December.
and on the 11th of November, Victoria
Deputy
Nuland.
Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and US Ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt supported Euromaidan. 15th December, Senator John McCain spoke at Maidan and said the United States backed him then head of the party of Green of European Parliament, Rebecca Hartles, 8th January, США embassy officials met with activists of Maidan, and so on and so forth. Why did I give those dates? Now let me give the dates to show that the dates that was thought to be a signal to seize capture. 22nd November formed Unconstitutional People's Rada of Ukraine that called to seize power. 23rd January, Ternopil, Lvov, Romel, city administration were captured, then Vinnytska administration, then 25th January, Chernigov, Plutovsk, and other administrations, then Sumskaya Rada. Authorities in Cherkassk, and then Kiev city power authorities, Ministry of Justice, warehouses, weapons, all this emerged at Maidan. Now 7 years have passed. Why no one of those who called for this in the West has ever arrived to look at the results of the work? Why does nobody arrive here to have a look at it? Now, how did they document that they committed a coup d'etat when they forced on the 21st February 2014, when they seized power and entered the parliament, they threatened the MPs. Those were threats, beatings. MPs were prevented from exiting the building. They humiliated them, and the parliament had to vote under this pressure. What was their first legal act? The first legal act was amnesty law. They wrote this law for themselves to have amnesty, to pardon themselves. I would say this is not an amnesty law, but a full statement of guilt. I'm a politician myself. I understand what can happen when many people come together. If amnesty law is adopted with regard to both sides, it is understandable. But what does it have to do with Article 109? Violent change of constitutional regime of state power. This is the article that they want amnesty for. Then infringement of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Then hostages, banditism, thefts, help with terrorist acts, attacks on the life of law enforcement officers. What is it? What does it have to do with the peaceful Maidan that they called a revolution of dignity? Then this law was something they used. By the way, amnesty was applicable only to those who were at Maidan, whereas it was not applicable to those who were against Maidan. So this law registered that first, all the evidence regarding the crimes committed by the participants of Maidan be destroyed. Second, prohibit the law enforcement authorities to collect evidence against those people. And after that, there was such a participant of Maidan named Ivan Bubenchik, who said that on the 20th of February, he approached journalists and cameras to say that he was the first to shoot dead a police officer. Any civilized society would have criminal investigation in place, but the prosecutor's office said they could not start criminal proceedings because this law prohibited them from doing so. Now, what they did to the constitution. This is Ukraine's constitution. Marked in yellow is what they changed on the 22nd. It envisages an entire procedure how amendments should be introduced. Let me highlight just one feature. Any state that has a constitution and constitutional court, all amendments are considered by the constitutional court in advance. This constitution was introduced on the 21st of February. Now, here I have a script of parliamentary meeting, which is available online. This document was adopted without prior endorsement, where by Constitutional Court it was adopted over just 8 minutes without any discussion. I'm a legal expert. I wrote 2 requests regarding this to the Parliament and to the Constitutional Court. To the Parliament, I asked whether they sent the draft law to the Constitutional Court. And to the Constitutional Court, I asked whether they received a draft law from the Parliament, and they didn't. So, this is how they changed the Constitution. And today, President Zelensky rests on this Constitution, which I believe is null and void, because it was adopted in defiance of any legal procedure. This is just amazing. There are many talks about the coup d'etat, so I decided to act as legal expert. Using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and having studied the Constitution of the Russian Federation, and I must say that I'm now here in Russia as a political refugee, and I remember the personal story of Oleg Tsarov, who ran for president. When I do not recognize the coup d'etat and call it a coup d'etat in all my interviews, myself and my family were pressurized. And once, when speaking in the parliament, and I was sitting in the hall, there was such an idea to pressurize an MP by beating his son, which is actually myself, made him call me to ask me change my position, and my son spent 30 days in ICU. Police officers, medical personnel saw this and they could do nothing about it. My home was attacked. Of course, an investigation in the case of my son was started, but up to today, the guilty have not been punished. Using the right that I'm granted by the Constitution of the Russian Federation, I turned to court, which as a result questioned Mr. Yanukovych, Mr. Azarov, Mr. Zakharchenko, Mr. Kluev, Mr. Pshonka, Mr. Yakimenko, and Mr. Raguzov. The court considered all the circumstances of the case and took a decision, I'm holding it here in my hands, that this was a coup d'etat. I proceeded from the international rules. A similar decision was made by American court regarding Honduras when 3 judges applied to consider the circumstances and establish effect of a coup d'etat. This is normal practice. I addressed the court asking what was my status here. I am here because I was prosecuted as a result of a coup d'etat. What I'm holding in my hand now is not a book of fiction. It is a compilation of all materials of the Doramilov Accord that I turned to, containing proofs of preparations for the coup d'etat, materials about Soros Foundation, materials about the preparation for the coup that started as early as 1990. It also contains information regarding the facts of preparation of terrorist groups in Western Ukraine, in Poland, in the Baltic states, that studied, that were trained how to carry out subversions. So in this case, I believe that Mr. Zelensky, who today reacted to those events in an unseemly way, though he had to react being a guarantor of the constitution. For example, he could have addressed the constitutional court to revoke this amnesty law, thus providing an opportunity to investigate into the Maidan events. He could have gotten into details of how the constitution was changed, because he was the one to support the idea of revolution of dignity. I believe by not doing this, he has become accomplice of these crimes. Because the process is not over, it is continuing up to today. The coup d'etat continues, and we are having its fruit now. I'm absolutely convinced that those are double standards, and what was called internal terrorism regarding the capital events was just child play as compared to what had happened in Ukraine. Law enforcement officers of Ukraine were killed. They were present at Maidan without any service weapons. And those who were throwing Molotov cocktails at them knew it. They knew that law enforcement officers had nothing to respond with. Because I believe otherwise they would have shot at those who were staying at the stage of Maidan and those who were orchestrating this process. So Mr. Tsarov is absolutely right. There were people and there were snipers who were acting at someone's behest, because without blood, there could be no revolution.
Give the floor to Mr. Dean O'Brien, as I said, a freelance photographer who is documenting events in Donbass, but he's also a witness of what happened in Maidan, at Maidan in 2014. Mr. O'Brien, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you, Council, for inviting me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm a freelance photographer from Coventry in Great Britain. I started traveling to Ukraine maybe 12, 13 years ago. It was a different country then, obviously. I did my photography degree based on numerous projects in Ukraine, and everything was fine. I've traveled throughout most of the country. Then in around about probably 2012, I noticed a little bit of a change, a rise in the far right. They were marching a lot in Kiev. I noticed they were burning Russian flags. You've got a rise of parties like Svoboda Party, Pravy Sector, Corpus Nationalists. And at that time, Russian was the national language in Ukraine. Everywhere you went, people spoke Russian. I've traveled from Lviv all the way over to Kramatorsk, Odessa, Poltava. I've been everywhere in Ukraine. Everybody speaks Russian. Then getting towards maybe 2012, 2013, there was this thing threatening Russian culture, threatening people speaking Russian. The far right had a big influence on the Ukrainian governments. They seemed to be holding a lot of power over them. When Maidan happened, it came as no surprise. The West had an unhealthy interest in Ukraine anyway, so they didn't have to do much to destabilize the country. and get the far right to, as you can see my images here, you can buy far right paraphernalia on the streets of Kiev. These are for sale on Maidan near the post office on Kreshchatyk. Stall sellers openly sell Nazi books, uniforms. You can buy anything. What I witnessed here was militants in combat. They overthrew government buildings in Kiev in the so-called Maidan. We all know what happened. The legally elected government was overthrown. The people in the East objected. You can't just overthrow a government. You can't just do that. So the people in the East objected. And what happened then was it escalated into war. It started off as a civil war. We know now it's now entering into 8 years of war. Over 13,000 people killed. But this is what started it. Maidan started this conflict. It wasn't Russians. People in the West think, oh, the Russians are in Ukraine. The Russians aren't in Ukraine. What happened was the West instigated a coup d'etat that overthrew the legally elected Ukrainian government. And this is what we're seeing today. We're seeing a war now, but it was instigated by the West. What happened was when things got a little bit awkward in Ukraine, I traveled more to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Mariupol, and I was speaking at some schools in there to children, and they said to me, you need to go to the other side. When they meant the other side, they meant to Donbass, over the conflict line, the border. They said, you need to speak to my grandparents, go and witness what's happening there, which is what I did. So I couldn't cross through Ukraine, so I had to fly to Moscow, travel down to Rostov-on-Don, enter into Donbass that way. And I went and witnessed what these people are living through, what Western-backed governments have supplied arms to Ukraine. And this is where they end up. This is how people are living. And you can see here that the people are living in bombed out houses. They're being shelled on a daily basis, children being killed. And I went and saw this with my own eyes. I couldn't rely on my own Western media because in the West, they tell you one thing, that Russian soldiers are there and Russians are starting this war. I traveled there myself. I paid to go myself and I saw for myself what's happening. There are no Russian soldiers in Eastern Ukraine. These pictures show how the people in Eastern Ukraine live, and nobody in Western media wants to tell their story. Nobody wants to tell the truth about what's happening. So I spoke to the children there. These people that live like this every day, they walk to school, they're being shelled, they're in sniper crosshairs, they're being fired. You're seeing this, how Centeversky Monastery, it's been virtually destroyed by shelling. It's outrageous what's happening. My work continues there. I will, as soon as the border reopens with Donetsk, I will return and I'll carry on with my projects there, because this issue needs to be addressed and highlighted. It's vital that people know what is happening. You can see here, I went and spoke to the people on the ground, and I was allowed to go and ask these people, and they said, why are the Ukrainian government trying to force me out of my home? And these old people, they've lived in these houses for years. You can't expect them to go and move to a city centre or an apartment. They live off the land. How would they ever survive? How would they ever pay the rent even? It's not possible. But the principle here is you can't ask these people to move from their homes. These people live near Donetsk airport. They live in the Kievsky district of Donetsk, which look at this apartment here. The people still live there. You'd think it was abandoned. People still live in that building. And they've come and met me and said, why should we move? Why should your government force us to move? And they're correct. Why should they move? They shouldn't have to move. This church, Centeversky, the monastery, they still hold a church service here every Sunday. Every Sunday, they still hold church. They hold mass in this church. The people will not be moved. This old lady lives on her own in this picture near Donetsk airport. She survives by searching for scrap metal, discarded shells. This is the reality of Donbass. But what we need to know is, why are we not reading about this? Why are Western media not reporting this? So this is the truth about Donbass.
I thank Mr. O'Brien for his testimony, and now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Anne-Laure Bonnel, a journalist and a filmmaker from France. Ms. Bonnel, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, messieurs les ministres, mesdames et messieurs les ambassadeurs,
Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, ambassadors,
journaliste et enseignante à Paris des médias, aussi bien à l'École supérieure de journalisme de Paris que...
Today I will be speaking as a director, journalist.
Les sources que je vais vous citer sont des sources sûres, françaises. Je les cite dans le but...
The sources that I'm going to quote are reliable French sources. I cite them to confirm the information that we had. In particular, I will cite information coming from military reconnaissance of France, conclusions of former foreign minister of President Chirac's administration, who is a reliable Western source, which I hope will help us avoid any claims and allegations that it be propaganda. In November 2015, I went to Donbass to shoot a documentary. However, prior to that, I would like to make a brief stop on Odessa and tell you of what I remember because of striking immense violence that I saw. 50 people were burned alive in the center of a European city in a fire that was set intentionally. It was a military crime. People who suffered were Ukrainians of Russian descent, and they were annihilated purposefully. I stress it. The building was set on fire with Molotov cocktails thrown by nationalist elements in Ukraine. In France, I saw that it was not censored too much. This episode is available on YouTube, but there was no investigation at any point. And this is what drove me towards shooting my documentary. Now, let me get back to what happened in winter 2014 and give you an account of General Christophe Gomer, who on the 25th of March 2015 spoke in front of Defense Commission of France's National Assembly. Being director of military reconnaissance at that point, he addressed assessments that his service gave to the crisis in east of Ukraine in September 2014. I quote him now. NATO reported that Russia was preparing to capture Ukraine, whereas according to the data of French military reconnaissance, there were no facts to support this thesis. Russia did not deploy any commando points or mobile units like field hospitals, which would let us believe they were preparing for a military invasion. Quote continues. Subsequent events proved us right because if there were Russian soldiers in Ukraine, we could believe it was about actions to execute pressure on President Poroshenko rather than execute an attempt of invasion. Getting back to the present-day situation of Ukraine, in fact, the country is broke, and the leadership realized the need for economic recovery. And this situation, President Yanukovych, as incompetent as he might be, decided that European aid promised to his country of 600 million euro was insufficient and demanded to increase it, but received a negative response from Brussels. After that, he rolled back and addressed Moscow's proposal that offered 15 billion as direct aid. Those figures is something we must bear in mind. At the same time, it was nothing strange because the major bulk of Ukraine's trade is with Russia, and the prospect of a new trade agreement with Russia drove the West-oriented and anti-Russian activists in Ukraine. The events of 2013 destroyed the democratic rules to which the West appeals. They overthrew the democratically elected President Yanukovych, who in 2010 won the presidential election, recognized as transparent and fair by the OSCE authorities. The so-called revolutionaries started to act when another presidential vote was pending in 2015, which indicates that if the opposition followed the democratic rules, it would have been enough to wait for just another year to act by political means. This so-called revolution, you heard it many times, was distinguished by extreme violence from the protesters. They used weapons, and many police officers were shot dead. The reason is that the most active elements of the revolutionary movement were ultra-right nationalists, private sector nationalists, militants. I will not dwell on it into detail. It was already commented upon. However, let me point out that the latter were trained and well organized, which let them take hostages of law enforcement officers. At the same time, this revolution represents interests only of Ukraine's western regions and rejects and defies the rights of those who voted for Yanukovych. It violates their basic rights. And let me stress that right after the seizure of power, the new government prohibited the use of Russian as the second national language in Ukraine. Let me also share with you the view of another French politician who believes that the guilt is equally split between the West and Russia. I quote, as a result of some sad mistakes, we have ended up having the present day situation. When I say it is about shared responsibility, I mean the overall treatment of Russia, post-Soviet Russia by the West. There was a series of provocative acts. The European Union strived to tear Ukraine apart from Russia, though there are many things that we may reproach Russia for. And this view of former Minister of Foreign Affairs indicates the responsibility of Europeans, of the European Union and the United States for these events. Those words were not broadly spread, but he had the courage to pronounce them. Before I get back to my movie, shot in Donbass in 2015-2016, I'd like to draw your attention to some questions that I believe are very important and that highlight the sources of the crisis. After the events of Maidan, the relation of Western countries was swift accusation of Russia. What NATO did contradicts to the UN Charter. On the 2nd of March, NATO Secretary General Andres Rasmussen, I hope you understand that such statements are deeply provocative. The reaction of the West ignored the width of the existing controversies. How can forced actions of Russia or President Putin be condemned that the Western media often covered, at the same time pay no attention to absolutely illegitimate overthrowing of the authorities? How can legitimate rights of only one part of the population be recognized, whereas define those rights for the other part of the population of the same country? To all those who are indignant at Russia's position, they should ask themselves the question: did they protest just as vigilantly when the United States captured Iraq, citing falsified evidence, circumvening the UN decision and leaving the country in a disastrous state? When Western states went beyond 1973 Libya resolution by turning a civilian protection operation into an operation to overthrow Gaddafi, the results of which are too well known to us, or when Edward Snowden disclosed the massive bugging of phones of US and other citizens. Now, after putting those questions, let me get back to what regards my professional competences as journalist. I was struck by how French media covered the events of Maidan, as well as their coverage of the events in Donbass. At the first sight, I thought that the media was oversimplifying things and painting them in a pro-Western manner. Many articles indicated Russian propaganda, but at the same time, the same media were either not impartial or they openly sided with Ukraine, or sometimes they listened to Ukrainian arguments rather than Russian ones. The first example is Washington's support for Ukraine, which was almost not covered in media. There were but few articles in 2013 citing that US troops were going to train Ukrainian soldiers, a small article in Figaro, and messages at AFP and some radio stations that were not spread further on by other media, that US soldiers were dispatched to train Ukraine's National Guard, not Ukraine's regular guard, but as the article indicated, was a volunteers army formed from self-defense militants and subordinate to the Minister of Internal Affairs. Among those soldiers were fighters of such brigades as Azov Battalion, which I will address a little bit later. What conclusion can we draw from this? Whereas many articles in French media condemn Russia's interference in the events in the east of Ukraine, the participation of the United States is not covered either by the authorities or by media or by the public opinion. Maybe because Russia and the United States cannot stand in one line regarding freedom of speech and freedom of media, but the coverage of the approaches of these sides was not equal. Now let's get back to the events in Odessa and to how they were covered by French media. After broad coverage of the Maidan revolution, mostly based on Ukraine's points, we saw a sharp turn after the fire in Odessa trade union house, and after people died here. This event made French media very indignant, and there were many publications in the first hours after this event. However, those publications were either incomplete or they distorted the reality. France 3 TV channel reported the fire, but it did not cover who the victims had been. AFP first reports from the scene of the crime do not indicate that Russia's supporters died in the fire. It was only the next day after those events that such articles appeared. Let us think of how French public opinion felt when they long consumed pro-Maidan and pro-West information. How should they interpret the information that they receive after that? The TV viewers believe that pro-Maidan forces were again attacked by Russia, whereas in reality, things were just the opposite. However, not everything was that gloomy. There were several articles indicating insufficient coverage of those events. For example, Marian magazine or Top Cadre TV program. However, we must realize that the audience of this TV program was much smaller than that of central TV channels like France 3. Libération newspaper made caricature coverage of the events in Odessa. They only gave the floor to the supporters of Maidan, which created an impression that pro-Russian forces were to blame for what happened. No one indicated that this information was false. No one wrote about women jumping off the windows to escape the fire and who were finished off when down on the ground with baseball clubs. Forgive me for these words, but people were shot just like rabbits. The tragedy of civil population in Mariupol was mentioned. However, what was not mentioned was that the Azov battalion was to blame for it. Let me get back to my documentary movie. You can learn the details. It all started when I realized that the media coverage of the events in Odessa was insufficient and unilateral. I noted President Poroshenko's speech in Ukraine's parliament, where he made harsh, even radical statement that the population of Ukraine's East would not receive its retirement payments, that their children would be hiding in the basements, and that this is how Ukraine would win that war. Apart from that, I noticed appalling footage of bombardments of Slavyansk that Ukrainian Air Force carried out. French media never reported this. My colleague made a coverage for a TV channel, and after that he was subjected to immense pressure from Ukraine's ambassador in France, who demanded to ban the screening of this film. And they raised great impediments towards the screening of this movie. When I went to Donbass, I also saw violent footage demonstrated at Ukrainian TV channels calling to destroy the population of eastern Ukraine, calling to annihilate 5 million of its population because they said Ukraine didn't need them. I witnessed violence at discussion platforms of Ukrainian TV channels. Which was so obvious and so straightforward that I was just embarrassed. All this information is easily searchable on the internet. If you fail to, I'm ready to share the links. So when I arrived in Donbass, it was in January 2015, and up to June 2015, I got back there frequently. In the meantime, Minsk agreements were adopted. What did I see there? First of all, we have to realize that this was an undeclared war. This war was not declared, it was declared as an anti-terrorist operation, which is a paradoxical situation. When Ukrainians are burnt down in Odessa, or when Donbass has all its supply lines cut off. It actually runs counter to the statements made by the interim government that promised to ensure social benefits. Donbass encountered an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. When I arrived there, there was no electricity, the infrastructure was destroyed. The people, women, including women and children, had to live in basements. Could you please explain to me how can we call it a terrorist operation and an anti-terrorist operation when the population of the country has to live in such conditions? Food dispensaries were bombarded, and the movie reflects all this. Hospitals, medical facilities were under fire. Add to this the lack of social benefits to the retired population. They did not receive any funds to make their living. It was cold, no electricity, no heat, no central heating in winter, empty shelves in local department stores because supplies were not possible under fire. How were they supposed to survive in such conditions? And despite this, they managed to survive. They managed to survive despite the fact that the border was closed and controlled by nationalist militants. We must remember that in terms of territory, this part of Ukraine is very small, and when there were artillery bombardments, the population literally had nowhere to go, unlike those who were located on the other side of the contact line. I traveled through the entire Donbass, and actually all of its territory can be reached by Ukraine's shellings. Banks, mines are closed, department stores empty. The youngest or the richest were able to leave. No pensions, no salaries, scarce access to medicine. I saw the hospitals that had to survive the best they could, that had to render assistance and first aid to those wounded at the contact line the best they could. I saw it all. The Ukrainian government isolated and bombarded the population of Donbass. It is as if Paris captured Britain region, undermined humanitarian access, stopped any social benefits. I met representatives of the local population who said they were Russian-speaking, they were pro-Russian, and that for them, the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of them felt nostalgic after the Soviet Union and did not recognize Western Ukraine. Those were two different cultures, two different mindsets, two different languages. And this is what the people of Donbass were punished for. Can, living in the 21st century, living today, can we punish people of a country for that? Is there love for Russia, or is there non-unwillingness to become part of Europe? Does it give enough reason to lock people down in basements and to shoot and shell at them? Please forgive me if I took too long. You can imagine what tragedy the economic blockade posed. This sniper fire, then the hospitals that do all they can, but they can too little, constant violence, killings. I witnessed bombings when just 100, 200 meters from me, people were dying. I saw it with my own eyes. And this is what I witnessed. The Minsk agreements are not implemented. This is obvious. I just repeat several provisions out of 13. See, truce not observed, lifting of economic blockade, economic recovery not seen this, recovery of Ukrainian border, access of humanitarian convoys only on the Russia side. Ukrainians do nothing to that end. I will stop here, but you know there are 13 provisions of the Minsk agreement, and you realize that they are not implemented. In my movie, Donbass was picked to participate in many festivals. During the first 2 months, the media and the press was unanimous regarding it. Then it was screened in 5 movie theaters. Then all of a sudden it was censored, deleted from the internet. And I think, and just as my colleague who was pressurized by Ukrainian embassy in France, demanding to ban the screening of this film, I think that in this situation we encounter a form of censorship, encounter a striving to make this film invisible, which I believe is absolutely non-political. I do not side with either of the parties. I simply give a say to civilians who tell of their everyday life under bombs, under shell, under fire. And they have no opportunity to leave the region. I thank you for giving the floor to me.
And now I would like to give the floor first to the council members that wanted to take it. And first I give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, less than a month ago, the mission of Russia organized a very similar meeting to promote the same false narrative about the history of the conflict in Ukraine. We regret this misuse of the time of the Security Council members, time that should be devoted to building consensus in the search for concrete solutions to the threats to international peace and security, including in Ukraine. I will therefore repeat what I already said last month. France regrets the attempts by the Russian Federation to divert the attention of the international community with the organization of this Arria-Formula meeting. We do not support in any way, shape, or form the narrative put forward by the organizers in their concept note. The reason why we participate in this meeting is to reaffirm France's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We commend the restraint and the sense of responsibility shown by the Ukrainian authorities in the recent phase of increased tensions. We call on Russia to cease its provocation and to de-escalate by withdrawing its troops from occupied Crimea and around Ukraine's borders, and agreeing with Ukraine on a recommitment to the ceasefire in the Donbass. Once again, France underlines that it does not and will not recognize Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. We reaffirm our support for the European Union policy of non-recognition of the annexation. We call on Russia to put an end to all human rights violations in the peninsula. Regarding the conflict in eastern Ukraine, France will continue its diplomatic efforts in close cooperation with Germany within the Normandy format to achieve the full implementation of the Minsk agreements. The sides have to engage constructively in the trilateral contact group on the OSCE's proposals to confirm and consolidate the ceasefire. These efforts remain essential to achieving a just and lasting peace and to restoring Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France who referred to a previous Arria-Formula meeting that we organized on the 5th of May, saying that we're promoting our false narrative. I think that my feeling is that certain countries that speak on that issue are promoting their own narrative on that issue without even giving a chance to listen to those people who are first-hand witnesses, and not only first-hand witnesses, but who are witnesses, real witnesses, what is happening in Ukraine. But we're not surprised, frankly. We didn't expect anything less or more from certain representatives of some certain fellow members of the council. Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me take this opportunity and the opportunity of this meeting to set out once again Ireland's strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and our support for Ukraine's legitimate authorities. Ireland also supports Ukraine's inclusive approach towards its citizens in the non-government controlled areas, including in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ireland does not recognize the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, nor any political structure created on the basis of this attempted annexation. Chair, I wish to reaffirm Ireland's full support for the work of the Normandy format, the OSCE, the Trilateral Contact Group, and the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. Let me recall that all signatories of the Minsk agreements agreed on the need for the Special Monitoring Mission's safe and secure access to the entire territory of Ukraine. Ireland commends the constructive approach of Ukraine in the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group, and calls on Russia to reciprocate and to cooperate with the legitimate government of Ukraine. Ireland is concerned that there are continued violations of the Trilateral Contact Group's agreements and reiterates that the ceasefire in force since last July must be used to move forward with the negotiations. Ireland views the OSCE Border Observation Mission as an important confidence-building measure and believes that its mandate should be broader in scope and in length. We therefore regret that only a 2-month extension of the mandate could be agreed in Vienna last week. This limited extension creates an additional administrative burden on both the mission and the OSCE and has a damaging impact on the overall political climate. Chair, we are also very concerned by the reduction of access for humanitarian organizations to the non-government controlled areas of the country. The humanitarian situation remains deeply concerning, with millions of people still requiring humanitarian assistance. Ireland therefore calls for the easing of movement restrictions to avoid exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. We urge Russia to implement the commitments it made at the Normandy summit in Paris, as well as in the Trilateral Contact Group, so that the Shachastna and Zolota entry-exit crossing points become fully operational, and that all the currently closed entry-exit crossing points are reopened. We also remain concerned about serious human rights violations and abuses linked to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, as reported by the monitoring mission of the OHCHR. We reiterate our call on Russia to allow unhindered access of international organizations and human rights actors to the non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, and to respect international humanitarian law. Finally, Chair, Ireland calls on all sides to create the necessary environment to enable the implementation of the Minsk agreements to achieve a sustainable political settlement of the conflict, and we call on all parties to act constructively within the Trilateral Contact Group and the Normandy format to this end. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the representative of Ireland. Now I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Ambassador. My remarks will be brief. I thank the briefers and participants for providing their perspective on this issue. Normally, issues are taken up for consideration by the UN Security Council only if they have ramifications for international peace and security. Others need to be discussed in a bilateral or plurilateral context. India, for its part, has always advocated political and diplomatic solutions that protect the legitimate interests of all countries in the region and ensure long-term peace and stability in Europe and beyond. The path forward can only be through peaceful dialogue for achieving a lasting solution acceptable to all concerned. We urge all parties to continue to engage through all channels of dialogue and to keep working towards the full implementation of the Minsk package. I thank you, Ambassador.
I thank the representative of India, and now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I thank the briefers for their presentations. Vietnam has been following closely the situation in Ukraine, without the sincere wish that all the people in Ukraine and the region could live in peace, harmony, and prosperity. We remain concerned about the situation in Ukraine, which complicated developments have still taken place recently, including reports of violations of the ceasefire agreement reached on 27 July last year. These challenges not only hinder the implementation of the concluded agreements, they are also not conducive to the pursuit of dialogue and engagement towards reaching a comprehensive and lasting settlement. We reiterate the need to settle all disputes through peaceful means in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. The situation in Ukraine has profound political, historical, and cultural factors. It not only affects the country, but also has far-reaching consequences to the region and its partners. It is therefore crucial that relevant parties should exercise utmost restraint, refrain from actions that could lead to increased tension, make efforts to overcome the differences, and engage in political and diplomatic processes. We encourage all parties to uphold commitments and fully implement existing agreements, including the Minsk agreement. We also call on the parties to enhance efforts related to confidence-building measures. Mutual understanding allows parties to advance the prospect for a long-term and peaceful solution acceptable to all. To this end, the role and support of the relevant stakeholders, regional countries, and the international community is of great importance to facilitate the realization of peace, stability, and development in Ukraine. And in this process, the legitimate interests and needs of the people must be taken into consideration. And regrettably, those living in eastern Ukraine continue to be affected by ongoing hostilities, coupled with hardship caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of people remain in need of humanitarian aid and internally displaced. It is our hope that the situation would soon be improved and humanitarian assistance could reach those in need. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Vietnam, and now I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Chair. I listened very carefully and attentively to the remarks of the briefers and other colleagues. China's position on the Ukraine issue is objective and impartial and remains unchanged. We respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, and oppose any interference in Ukraine's internal affairs by any external forces. We firmly believe that the Ukraine issue cannot be resolved by force, and dialogue and the negotiation is the only way out. The Ukraine issue has a very complicated historical background, and its development involves many contentious factors. All parties should have an objective and comprehensive understanding on the causes and the development of the issue, and resolve their differences through dialogue and the negotiation. China believes that all relevant parties should implement the new Minsk agreement earnestly, stick to political settlement, and seek a comprehensive solution to the Ukraine issue through peaceful efforts. We encourage all parties to work together to promote peace, stability, and development in Ukraine. China will continue to play a positive and constructive role in the political settlement of this issue. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the representative of China. Now I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador. Mexico is concerned that despite the July 2020 agreement on a ceasefire, there are reports of increased violations in the Donbass region. We are particularly concerned for the 3.4 million people that require humanitarian assistance and protection, and how the pandemic and the prolonged closure of the contact line has increased the vulnerability of this population. Therefore, we call once again on all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and to allow for the safe and unhindered access of humanitarian personnel to those requiring assistance. We consider it essential that the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission has full and safe access in order to fulfill its mandate in contributing to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security. Cognizant of the grave impact of illicit transfer, accumulation, and misuse of arms on the stability of the region, we underscore the importance of strengthening national and regional measures and strategies to control international weapons transfers and the supply of munition and ammunition. This would undoubtedly constitute fundamental confidence-building measures for the parties and a foundation for peace. We will continue to follow the situation in Eastern Ukraine closely and reaffirm the importance of complying with Security Council Resolution 2202. We call on the Trilateral Contact Group and the Normandy Quartet to revamp efforts to advance dialogue in order to achieve a comprehensive negotiation and peaceful solution to the conflict. Mexico expresses its hope that the efforts between the parties can be redoubled to advance in the implementation of the Minsk agreements so that they can overcome the deadlock. We reiterate that there is no military solution to this conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy are the only vehicles for peaceful settlement and its comprehensive management. Finally, Mexico wants to underline once again the need to respect the unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the representative of Mexico. Now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Niger. Abari, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes heureux de participer à cette réunion et de vous remercier de l'avoir convoquée. Je voudrais également, à travers vous, remercier les différents présentateurs pour la qualité de leurs témoignages et de leurs présentations. Monsieur le Président, depuis son déclenchement en 2014, le conflit armé dans l'est de l'Ukraine continue d'impacter négativement l'environnement socio-économique et sécuritaire du pays. En effet, dans les zones de conflit, la situation qui prévaut a porté un coup dur à l'activité économique, plongeant ainsi des communautés entières dans la pauvreté. Selon une étude menée par le PNUD en collaboration avec ONU Femmes et l'Organisation des Nations Unies pour l'alimentation et l'agriculture, 84% des ménages ont perdu des revenus et 43% ont au moins un membre qui a perdu son emploi. Par ailleurs, la récente escalade des tensions qui illustre la fragilité du cessez-le-feu démontre à suffisance la précarité de la situation sécuritaire. Dans l'est de l'Ukraine, 3,4 millions de personnes ont besoin d'assistance humanitaire et de services de protection, dont les plus vulnérables sont les femmes et les enfants, les personnes âgées et celles portant un handicap. Face à cette situation, ma délégation exhorte les parties à intensifier leurs efforts au sein du format de Normandie et du groupe de contact trilatéral en vue de parvenir à un règlement politique du conflit. Nous les invitons également à la mise en œuvre des conclusions concertées du sommet de Paris de 2019, ainsi que de la résolution 2202 du Conseil de sécurité prévoyant un paquet de mesures pour la mise en œuvre des accords de Minsk. Monsieur le Président, pour conclure, ici comme ailleurs, seul le dialogue permettra aux parties de surmonter leurs divergences et de paver le chemin de la paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank Ambassador of Niger for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Belarus, to the permanent representative of Belarus. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you, Vasily. We are grateful to the Russian Federation for convening this important meeting today, and this is a very good format to discuss pressing issues from a deeper perspective, to try to define the reasons and the root causes of conflicts. The issue under discussion today is exactly about this. The Maidan events in Ukraine back in 2013 and 2014 have their own background and have their own outcome and aftermath, and which are still being widely misinterpreted even now. The most obvious lesson, which we all have to learn, but unfortunately, as we can see, it has not been learned so far, is that chaos and protests that spill over to the streets can never lead to peace and stability. What we see from the Maidan example is that violence, bloodshed, and dozens of victims during the days of protests in Kiev, and that's practically it. The lesson, which seems to be ignored by many so-called concerned countries, is that mass protests were encouraged and supported from outside of the Ukraine, fueling hatred, violence, and outrage. It is therefore regrettable and tragic to hear lecturing on who is responsible for the events that had actually led to Maidan. Furthermore, events in Kiev, how street protests and subsequent violence can trigger a full-scale conflict all over the country. That provoked a real military confrontation, the consequences of which we have been facing ever since. Belarus, as a host country for negotiations on resolution of the conflict in Donbass, is more than anybody else aware of how agile the process of peace building can be. And finally, those responsible for the crimes and for the atrocities during the Maidan events are still unpunished and are yet to be brought to justice. These are just a few examples of those lessons we all have to keep in mind, especially those who try to apply the same revolution patterns to other countries and to current political crises. We have to learn from the past not to repeat those mistakes. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Belarus for his statement. I think that brings us to the end of the list of speakers that enlisted to speak. And to our briefers, I would like to say that this gives you rather good understanding of how cut section of how issues related to Ukraine are being discussed in the Council and in the UN in more general terms. Now I'd like to give the floor to our briefers for their short concluding remarks of around 5 minutes each. And I will start in reverse order, and I would like to give the floor first to Ms. Bonnel.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Suite à tout ce que j'ai pu entendre
Thank you, Mr. President. From what I heard from my fellow citizen, I would like to add a few words regarding the US interference that we said too little of. Let me say that Ukraine was governed by elites that were robbing the country. We can point out that the government formed in 2004 as a result of Revolution of Color was no different. In this regard, let me remind of Yulia Tymoshenko, a businesswoman and oligarch who built her fortune from gas trade. Being vice prime minister for energy, she was made retire on accusations of smuggling Russian gas. When she was head of National Gas Company. In 1999, she was sentenced to 7 years of prison for profiteering of gas contracts signed with Russia. There was excessive evidence of her guilt. As for the United States participating in Maidan events, we can get back to financial support. In January 2014, CIA director visited Ukraine. What was most striking for me, here I'm addressing Ireland and France, what was most striking for me regarding the interference in internal affairs, the appointment of American Natalia Yureska as finance minister of Ukraine. Her biography is easily searchable on the internet. She took several different offices in the Department of State, and out of respect for the sufferings of the people of Ukraine, we must remember about those facts that were not sufficiently covered. In December, she was appointed finance minister of Ukraine, and let me remind that she received Ukrainian citizenship on the day she assumed her office. In fact, she is a US official born in Chicago. You can search her bio on Wikipedia. Let me remind that Ms. Yureska assumed several offices in the State Department, including head of section of the US diplomatic mission in Ukraine from 1992 to 1995. Beverdrin gave numerous advice as to ways out of crisis, in particular pointing out that Russia's interference was at the very least not bigger than the interference of NATO or neighboring countries, speaking about manipulations and interference as a pretext for winning some time. It demonstrates insufficient professionalism because it only takes a short internet search to dig out information that cannot be contested, speaking about the Russian interference. where state officers in Ukraine are taken by Americans, and also what was the role of CIA director for that end. We are gathered here at the United Nations in order to advocate for human rights and for peace. We need to be objective and impartial. History cannot be either black or white, as we all know. History tends to rather be gray. And we must stop increasing stakes in our mutual accusations if we are after the implementation of Minsk agreements that would be beneficial for all states. But neither Europe nor Ukraine can win anything in an open conflict with Russia. I hope that the decisions to be made will result from serious research, as journalists sometimes do, that it will be based on responsible, on trusted sources. Only this will let you act with dignity in this prolonged conflict.
Mr. O'Brien, do you have anything to say as final comments? Please switch on the mic.
Okay.
Once again, switch the mic. You switched it off. Yes.
Okay. I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me on. Like I said, I wasn't paid by anybody to go to Donbass. I've been traveling to Ukraine for over 13 years. It was a natural progression to go there. Why Western media don't want to cover both sides of this conflict is mind-boggling, because there are two sides to this story, and I'm glad this meeting was about the crux of what happened, what started this. It was Maidan, yet they just want to kind of smooth over this and not discuss it any further. Like I say, I travelled there. I've witnessed with my own eyes what's happening. I spoke to the people on the ground. It's just mind-boggling that nobody wants to cover it. It doesn't want it. Western media don't want it on the news at all. They're just convinced that it is something that Russia are behind, that there are Russian troops there, but there are no Russian soldiers there in Donbass. I've been there. It's important now, though, that entering into 8 years of conflict, that there is talk. Both sides do need to sit down and talk. I understand that the Ukrainian government do not want to meet with the leaders of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, but they have to. They have to stop the deaths, to stop the killing, to stop the poverty. As with all these wars, the main people that suffer are the poor people that suffer. It's convenient for a lot of people in Ukraine, I believe, for this war to continue, and I believe it needs to stop. They need to sit round and table and talk. And I think that's where the resolution will come, where they need to find some common ground. But one thing is for sure, after speaking to the people of Donbass, giving up the republics is not on the negotiating table. They will not give up Donetsk and Lugansk to integrate back into the Ukraine government controlled. They will not do it. They will not return to Kiev controlled government. So somehow there has to be some kind of peace agreement, stop the shelling, stop the fighting, and come to some agreement as to how they can move forward now. That's all I've got to say. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you
for your comments. Now you can switch off your mic.
Thank you.
And I'd like to give the floor now to Mr. Olenik, Vladimir Nikolaevich. Владимир Николаевич, микрофон включите. Включите микрофон, пожалуйста.
Turn on your mic, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, all the briefers and all the participants to our discussions. You know, if we follow the principle that once was formulated by President Roosevelt, his son of a bitch, but our son of a bitch, we will never find the truth. We need to look at things objectively. We heard the point of view that the government with under President Yanukovych, there was corruption, there was theft. Yes, that's true. Everything of that took place. But if we lived better today, that would be another thing. Sometimes they're bad means, but they lead to good results. But in this case, there was bad means and bad results. Let's speak frankly. From the outfit, initially there was elected, and right now this continues. There was anti-Russian rhetorics. Crimea was still there. There was no referendum, and the Lugansk and Donetsk People Republics did not exist. But already on Maidan, they were saying those who are not jumping, those are pro-Moscow, and they were inciting anti-Russian sentiments. And the Westerners were silent. They did not react. The Westerns were saying, well, let's not use force against them. Those are just jokes. And I'm surprised with those double standards because, for example, those grabbed power through military means. And the first day, they only adopted law on ammunition, but they also canceled the law on the language of minorities. Why did they need that? Because those are majority of Russian people, people who live in Crimea, and with those measures, they were inciting some sentiments that would not lead to compromise. And let's speak frankly, every revolution is the loss of territory. Crimea left in part not because of that. Even on the Yushchenko, we were looking for some common points. Crimea left because the rules were broken, because before there was an agreement. The only way to change power is through elections. Yanukovych was legitimate, the government, the parliament was legitimate. Let's wait. And then the second thing, why didn't they implement the agreement that the Western countries supported? Because even in November, they were saying that the agreement on premature elections in December, that was the right thing to do, but then this agreement wasn't supported. Of course, it is a very complicated dispute between Zelensky and the negotiation team that insists on first giving the border and then election, or the election and the border. But in this agreement, it states first election, then the border. Well, this is a contested issue, of course. But why are you implementing the paragraph 5 of this agreement that says that there's amnesty for those who live in Donbass through signing a law? On the 16th of September, the parliament spoke to Poroshenko, not Putin, not one of the Russian representatives. The parliament was speaking. The law on special status, it was adopted and signed, but it's not enacted, but still. And then the law on amnesty, it wasn't adopted. What does it give? There was an exchange of prisoners, and but this is a violation of all the laws because there was an exchange of Ukrainians for Ukrainians. But then they continued to criminally persecute those people. And the first terrorist group in Ukraine was not Donetsk Luhansk Public Republic of Crimea, it was Maidan. But when Maidan was under the control of the constitution, and when there are killings and the persecution doesn't have access to what is going over there, me as a deputy of Ukrainian people of the parliament, I cannot enter, and Ms. Nuland could do that. Mr. McCain, what kind of territory is that? And this is a territory where there were 12,000 militias who grabbed power. Well, let's persecute them as well. And the last thing, the sovereignty that is being discussed, the territorial integrity, those are interlinked. They're saying, please don't violate the sovereignty and territorial.
Генерального прокурора Украины, это не
Tell that
ваша
to Mr. Biden.
компетенция. Не снимайте, это
But
компетенция.
don't talk about the general prosecutor of Ukraine. And those are double standards. So we will not come to an agreement until we speak the common language. If, so to say, quoting Roosevelt, he's the son of a bitch, then it doesn't matter whose side he's on. Thank you for your words. Now I give the floor to Mr. Tsarev. I would like to thank all the briefers, especially Anna and Dean, for their very bright and vivid pictures. And I would like to say that Anna is not only a professional, but a very, very beautiful woman. And I'm very sorry that I didn't get a chance to meet her in Donbass because we were there at the same time, but I met your colleagues. I'm the one hurt anyone, but I'll just tell you my discussions. One of the journalists told me, Oleg, I'm very sorry, but I have to leave Donbass. And I was asked why. And he told me that he never got in a situation like this before. But in fact, I'm an angel of war. I'm everywhere where war takes place, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, where there's shootings taking place, where people are being killed. I risk my life. I get paid very much for getting all the shootings from those heart-wrenching pictures. The news agencies, they pay me a lot of money. But here in Donbass, I have a lot of material. Great, well, so to say, not great at all when it comes to the contents, because I can't hold my tears when I'm looking at those, because those are dead children and elderly. But nobody wants to buy this material. No one wants to pay for it, because I don't get any money for all the material that I shot. So once again, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Dean, for coming, for doing your job. I understand that it was very, very difficult because everyone takes risks who goes there, because the bomb and shelling could happen at any time. And I talked to the representatives of the OSCE that work in their mission. I haven't met bad people among them. Lots of them learned Russian, they're in love with Russia. They love Russia and they don't understand what has been happening after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russians live in Russia, in Ukraine, in many other countries, in other republics. I've heard the remarks of the Security Council members, and I think that you are mistaken in the most essential thing. Nobody, never in their life, put Russians on their knees. If you think that you can deprive people of their language, you can strangle them with sanctions, you can frighten them, you won't get any result, because there should be another way to solve this conflict, not by force. That's all.
Practically to the conclusion of our meeting, and I would like to say a few words in the end. Mr. Olenik was saying that he is surprised by double standards that he witnessed before, and he would perhaps witness today. I must tell him that we are not surprised by double standards. We've been through it for all these 7 years of this conflict. We tried to deliver the message, and we continue to try. We continue trying And that's why we are holding these Arria-Formula meetings, which are about not only about actual events, but also about the retrospective, the genesis of this conflict, if you will, the root causes to which I referred. To that, when we hear our Western colleagues, we hear the same narrative all the time. They read their copied statements. We know all the elements of those statements. Well, that's in a way understandable, because as today was witnessed by the actual participants of the events, some of these countries are directly complicit in what happened in Ukraine in 2014 and what is happening in Ukraine, what has been happening in Ukraine since then. And the price of what is happening in Ukraine, what happened and happening in Ukraine, as Dean O'Brien said, are lives of the ordinary people, lives of citizens who live sometimes in miserable conditions, who do not have clear destiny. And I must remind to all of you that these are Ukrainian citizens who should be taken care of by the Ukrainian authorities, but who choose to neglect them, to call them separatists, terrorists. When I hear this, I'm always amazed, as if Donbass went to invade Kiev, and not Kiev came to Donbass with the Ukrainian army, with the orders to shoot and kill its own citizens. I think that the meeting today was useful, despite that we heard some well-recognizable comments from some of our colleagues. I would like to wholeheartedly thank our briefers today, who, despite and whatever, are trying to bring the message across, to bring truth, so that the truth is heard. And I'm sure that one day or the other, the whole truth about what happened in Ukraine, what is happening now, and how this conflict should be resolved, will finally reach those who are instrumental in facilitating doing so. I thank you very much once again, and I wish you all the best. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.